The clock struck midnight as Emily tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her headlights the only thing piercing the darkness of the empty, seemingly endless road. She had heard stories about people vanishing without a trace on this route, but she had laughed them off. After all, who believes in ghost stories anymore? But now, with nothing but the hum of her car engine and the thick, eerie fog that had settled around her, she was beginning to wish she'd taken a different way home. It had been a long day at work, and all Emily wanted was to crawl into her bed. The GPS had rerouted her onto a road she wasn't familiar with, an old, winding stretch of asphalt surrounded by dark woods. There wasn't another car in sight, and not a single streetlight illuminated her path. The shadows cast by the trees seemed to stretch out toward her, creeping closer with each passing moment. A sense of unease settled in her chest, but she shrugged it off, attributing it to exhaustion. The eerie silence of the night was interrupted only by the low hum of her car engine, which seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. She reached over to turn on the radio, hoping the music might alleviate the anxiety building in her chest, but all she got was static. She flicked through the stations, her fingers growing restless as the static persisted. Not a single channel came through, not even the usual late-night talk shows. Suddenly, her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, lighting up the small compartment of her car. Emily glanced over, but there was no notification. Confused, she picked up her phone. It displayed nothing but the usual home screen. That's when she noticed her battery was at 3%, and she cursed under her breath, knowing it would die soon. She put the phone back down, and when she looked up, her heart lurched. In the middle of the road stood a figure, tall, motionless, its silhouette barely visible in the hazy light. Emily slammed on her brakes, tires screeching as her car skidded to a halt. Her heart pounded against her chest as she tried to make out the figure. It was a man, his face obscured by a hood, standing perfectly still. She sat there, hands trembling slightly, unsure of what to do. Honking seemed risky. She didn't want to provoke the stranger. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly stepped off the road, disappearing into the thick woods without a word or even a glance in her direction. Emily exhaled shakily, muttering, "What is wrong with people?" She quickly drove forward, her eyes nervously scanning the trees. As the road stretched ahead, the woods on either side seemed to grow denser, the shadows heavier. She could no longer shake the feeling that she was being watched. Another half-mile passed, and then she saw it again. The same figure, standing on the side of the road, watching her as she approached. Her stomach dropped. It was impossible. There was no way that person could have gotten ahead of her. She pressed her foot down on the gas pedal, her car speeding up as she raced past the figure. She didn't dare look directly at it, but out of the corner of her eye, she saw the hooded head slowly turning to follow her car's movement. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she tried to focus on the road ahead, but the unease was creeping into panic. She glanced at her rearview mirror. Nothing but darkness. No sign of the figure. Then, without warning, her radio crackled to life. Static filled the car, loud and abrasive, making her jump. The volume knob wouldn't turn it down, and the buttons seemed unresponsive. Among the static, she thought she heard something, a voice, whispering her name. Emily. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at the radio, her pulse pounding in her ears. It was just the exhaustion, she told herself. She was imagining things. But the whisper came again, more insistent this time, almost pleading. "Emily, stop." She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, no, no," she whispered. She had to get out of here. She pressed her foot down harder, the engine roaring as her speed increased. She just needed to get off this road. Up ahead, she saw a sign for a gas station, a tiny beacon of hope in the midst of the oppressive darkness. She turned into the station, her tires crunching on the gravel, and pulled up beside the only pump. The place looked deserted, but the lights were on. She jumped out of the car, her eyes scanning her surroundings, half expecting the hooded figure to be standing there, waiting for her. Emily's hands shook as she fumbled with the pump, her eyes darting around the lot. The air was thick with silence, the kind that felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. As she replaced the pump, she heard it again, the whisper, closer this time. "Emily?" She spun around, her heart pounding. The hooded figure was standing at the edge of the gas station lot, just beyond the circle of light cast by the overhead bulbs. She couldn't see his face, but she could feel his eyes on her, cold and unblinking. Her entire body went cold, and she bolted back into her car, locking the doors. She started the engine, her hands slick with sweat, and slammed her foot on the gas. The car sped away from the station, the figure vanishing into the darkness behind her. She didn't slow down, her knuckles white as she gripped the wheel. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the forest around her pressing in, closer and closer. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and her blood ran cold. The figure was in her back seat, his hood pulled low over his face, his mouth barely visible, a cruel smile curving up at the corners. Emily screamed, the car swerving violently as she lost control. It skidded off the road, the tires crunching against the gravel shoulder before slamming to a stop. She looked back, nothing. The back seat was empty. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her vision blurring with tears. She forced herself to look forward, the road stretching ahead into the darkness. She had to keep moving. She had to get off this road. As she drove, the whisper returned, soft and echoing in her ears. It wasn't coming from the radio this time, it was inside her head. "Emily, you can't leave." Tears streamed down her face as the figure appeared again, this time standing in the middle of the road ahead. She didn't slow down. She couldn't. She had to get away. She closed her eyes, pressing her foot down on the gas. The car hurtled forward, and for a moment there was silence. Then there was a thud, a heavy, sickening sound, and the car jolted, throwing her forward. She opened her eyes, her heart pounding. The road ahead was empty. She pulled over, her entire body trembling. She had to see. She had to know. She stepped out of the car, her knees weak, and walked around to the front. There was nothing there. No body. No sign that anything had been in the road at all. Emily looked around, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The whisper came again, a chilling breath against her ear. "You can't escape, Emily." She turned, and there he was, standing right behind her. His face still hidden, the smile still curling at the corners of his mouth. His eyes, empty voids of darkness, seemed to swallow her whole. Emily stumbled backward, her breath catching as she fell to the ground. Her eyes were glued to the figure, her entire body trembling in terror. Slowly, the figure stepped forward, its movements unnaturally smooth, like it was gliding. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat as he reached out toward her. His hands, long, bony, and almost translucent, seemed to shimmer in the darkness. He moved closer until he was towering over her, and in a voice like the rustling of dry leaves, he whispered, "You took the wrong road, Emily, and now you're mine." Suddenly, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the figure. Emily blinked against the bright light, her heart pounding. The figure seemed to vanish, dissolving into the shadows as if it had never been there. A car pulled up, and a young man stepped out, his face full of concern. "Are you okay?" he called out, hurrying over to her. "I saw your car pulled over and—" Emily's body shook as she tried to find her voice. There was someone," she whispered, her eyes darting around the darkness, but there was nothing, no sign of the figure. The man looked confused, glancing around. "Someone? I didn't see anyone." Emily shook her head, trying to stand. The man helped her up, and she leaned against her car for support. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "This road, people say it's haunted." Emily looked at him, her eyes wide. I know," she whispered. The man nodded, his face grim. "Come on, let's get you out of here." He helped her into her car and offered to follow her until they reached the nearest town. Emily's hands still trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her eyes darting to the rear-view mirror every few seconds. The road ahead seemed endless, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Finally, they reached the town. The streetlights were a welcome sight, their warm glow a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the road behind her. She pulled into a diner parking lot, her entire body sagging with relief as she parked. The man pulled up beside her, giving her a reassuring nod before driving away. Emily sat there for a moment, her head resting on the steering wheel. She had made it. She was safe. But as she looked up, her heart skipped a beat. In the reflection of the diner window, she saw him, the hooded figure, standing just behind her car, his smile curling up at the corners. Emily's scream echoed in the empty parking lot, and then everything went dark. Emily woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the warmth of the morning sun against her face. She was sitting in her car, which was parked at the side of the road. Her heart raced, the memories from the night before rushing back like a flood. She turned around, expecting to see the hooded figure in her back seat, but it was empty. She looked out of the car window and realized she was at the same spot where she had pulled over before everything went dark. It was as if she had never left. There were no other cars, no gas station in sight. The forest stretched around her, silent, with the light of dawn creeping through the leaves. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling as she tried to call for help, but there was no signal. The battery was drained down to 1%. She needed to get out of there. She started her car, the engine sputtering to life. The empty road stretched ahead of her, and she took a deep breath. She had no choice but to continue forward. As she drove, she noticed something in her peripheral vision, a flash of movement. She looked to her left, and there it was again, deeper into the woods, darting between the trees. Her heart began to pound as she realized the hooded figure was following her, keeping pace with her car as she drove down the road. She accelerated, her foot pressing harder on the gas, but no matter how fast she went, the figure remained, moving through the trees without effort, its form flickering in and out of the shadows. Panic gripped her. She needed to escape this road. The same gas station sign appeared again, and she turned sharply, tires skidding as she made her way back to the pumps. But the gas station wasn't the same as before. The pumps were old, rusted, covered in vines. The lights that had once offered her a sense of safety were shattered, and the place was overgrown, abandoned for decades. Emily's breathing grew shallow. She stepped out of the car, looking around in desperation. The whisper returned, louder this time, echoing from all directions. "Emily, you belong here." The whisper seemed to come from the trees, the broken pumps, even from inside her own mind. Her vision blurred with tears as she spun in a circle, trying to find the source of the voice. Her foot caught on something, and she stumbled, falling to the ground. And then she saw it, etched into the side of the gas pump, barely visible under the rust and grime, was her name. Scratched into the metal as if by a desperate hand, Emily. A cold realization washed over her. She wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. This road had taken others before her, each of them trapped, their names etched into the bones of this desolate place. The hooded figure, still nothing more than a shadow at the edge of her vision, seemed to multiply. There were more of them, each wearing the same dark hood, each with that cruel, knowing smile. Emily's scream tore through the silence as the figures began to close in on her. She scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the rough ground as she tried to get back to her car. She managed to get inside, locking the doors and jamming her key into the ignition. The car roared to life, and she sped away from the gas station, the figures fading into the distance behind her. The road stretched on, winding through the forest, endless. No matter how far she drove, there was no exit, no sign of civilization, just the oppressive trees and the thickening fog. Her phone, lying useless on the seat beside her, finally died, the screen going black. Hours seemed to pass, or maybe it was minutes, Time had lost all meaning. Exhaustion clawed at her, her eyes burning as she forced herself to stay awake. She couldn't stop. She couldn't let them catch her. Up ahead, something new appeared. A house. An old, decrepit house, standing alone on the side of the road. Its windows were shattered, the front door hanging loosely from its hinges. Emily knew she should keep driving, but something drew her to it. She slowed the car, her eyes fixed on the house. The whisper returned, soft and coaxing. "Come home, Emily." Her hands seemed to move on their own, turning the wheel toward the house. The car rolled to a stop in front of it, the engine dying as if it too had given up. Emily stepped out, her body moving as if in a trance, her eyes fixed on the dark doorway of the house. She walked up the creaking steps, her breath catching in her throat as she crossed the threshold. The air inside was thick, the smell of decay overwhelming. The whisper echoed through the empty halls, each word like a cold finger against her skin. "Emily, you can't leave. You belong here." The door slammed shut behind her, and darkness swallowed her whole.